Welcome to Detective Notebook, your cozy corner for mystery lovers, where Agatha Christie-inspired stories come to life. Today, I have a brand new tale for you. Before we begin, I'd love to know a bit about you. Where in the world are you listening from? And how has your day been? Share your thoughts in the comments. It's always wonderful to see this community connect through stories. If you enjoy today's mystery, don't forget to subscribe and join our Detective Notebook family. Now, settle in and step quietly with me into today's mystery. Chapter 1. Arrival at the Majestic Palm. The evening air was rich with the scent of salt and roses as carriages and motor cars pulled, one by one, before the grand steps of the Majestic Palm Hotel. Its white facade gleamed in the last rays of the seaside sun, a sight that made even the weariest traveller pause. Inside, the lobby glowed with amber lamps and polished brass, their reflections rippling across marble floors like liquid gold. A piano played softly somewhere beyond the archway, the melody mingling with the hum of arrival and greeting. Mr. Harcourt, the hotel's manager, stood poised at the entrance, a trim man with slicked hair and a smile so perfectly measured it seemed rehearsed. Yet behind the courteous gestures and well-timed nods, there was a tension in his eyes, as though he were keeping watch for something, or someone. Miss Marple, standing quietly among the arriving guests, saw it at once. She was here at the invitation of Lady Caroline Dent, an old acquaintance from St. Mary Mead, but her gentle curiosity rarely slept. It stirred now, though the scene before her looked entirely ordinary. A sleek motor car drew up, and out stepped a tall woman dressed in dove-grey silk. The fashionable widow, Mrs. Fenwick, carried herself with the poise of one accustomed to attention. She greeted the manager with an elegant nod, and he bowed just a little too deeply. Behind her came the retired Colonel Stroud, his cane tapping firmly against the marble, his sharp eyes assessing every corner of the lobby as if inspecting troops. Near him, a bespectacled man struggled with a suitcase and an untidy scarf. The novelist, Mr. Linton, already lost in his own thoughts, murmuring phrases for his next book. Miss Marple observed them all with mild interest, her gloved hands folded neatly before her. To the casual onlooker, she seemed merely another elderly guest enjoying a small adventure by the sea, but her mind catalogued every detail. The nervous flicker in the manager's expression, the way the widow's gloved hand trembled slightly as she signed the register, the colonel's sharp glance at the bellboy's delay, the novelist's absent smile when no one was speaking to him. Mr. Harcourt ushered everyone toward the drawing-room for tea, insisting that the view of the bay was at its best before dusk. Indeed, it was beautiful, the horizon tinged with rose and gold, gulls wheeling lazily over the water. Yet even here, amid the calm of the coast, something faintly unsettled lingered in the air. Miss Marple could not have said why, only that the perfection of the moment seemed to strain under its own weight. Lady Caroline arrived at last, laughing and radiant, greeting Miss Marple with delight. They spoke softly over tea about the charity gala to be held the following evening, a grand affair promising fine music and generous donations. Miss Marple smiled and agreed it all sounded perfectly splendid. But as Mr. Harcourt passed by once more, his smile tight yet weary, she found herself wondering what shadow hid behind such polished grace. For sometimes the grandest smiles hide the deepest worries. The drawing-room at the Majestic Palm was a masterpiece of seaside elegance. High windows dressed in cream lace, palms nodding faintly in their porcelain pots, and the soft clink of china blending with the murmuring sea beyond. Afternoon tea had been laid with quiet perfection, delicate sandwiches, small scones brushed with sugar, and a gleaming silver pot from which steam curled like a slow exhale. Outside, the sky was beginning to shift. Clouds, once feathery and white, gathered into darker folds over the horizon. Miss Marple sat comfortably near the window, her teacup balanced in steady hands, her knitting resting on her lap. Around her, conversation rose and fell in gentle tides. The widow, Mrs. Fenwick, laughed lightly with the novelist, though her eyes often drifted toward the Colonel, seated across the room. Colonel Stroud pretended not to notice, his attention fixed on the rain-speckled glass, yet every so often his jaw tightened in what looked very much like irritation. To anyone else it was an ordinary afternoon among polite strangers. To Miss Marple it was a room full of small signs and subtle currents. The novelist, Mr. Linton, was speaking about his latest work, a crime story set in a country house. "It's all about motive, you see," he explained, stirring his tea with unusual force. "People commit terrible acts, not because they are wicked, but because they believe they must." His words hung in the air like the scent of bergamot. Mrs. Fenwick smiled faintly, but the smile did not reach her eyes. Miss Marple noticed the widow's fingers tracing the edge of her saucer, round and round, as though she was smoothing over something unseen. Lady Caroline entered the room, bright and bustling, asking after everyone's comfort. "Tomorrow will be quite the night," she declared. "The orchestra from Bath, the mayor himself, such excitement for our quiet coast." The Colonel gave a short nod, muttering that such things were better suited for London. The widow answered with a light quip about village charm. Their voices brushed against each other like dry leaves, polite but brittle. Miss Marple sipped her tea, eyes on the darkening sea. A gull swooped low, its cry sharp against the rising wind. "Storms," she said softly, almost to herself, "tend to bring all manner of things ashore." The novelist glanced up with a curious smile. "A metaphor, Miss Marple?" he asked. She returned the smile mildly. "Perhaps. Or perhaps just an observation from someone who's spent a good deal of time watching both weather and people." The rain began in earnest then, soft at first, then tapping steadily against the glass. The light shifted, warm golds giving way to cool greys. Guests moved closer to the fire, conversations clustering in smaller groups. Miss Marple listened, saying very little. From the widow she caught mention of a lost letter. From the Colonel, a hint of disapproval wrapped in courtesy. From the novelist, the restless air of a man who noticed more than he should. Each fragment slipped quietly into her mind, a puzzle piece not yet belonging anywhere, but too interesting to discard. When the tea service was cleared and lamps were lit, the manager appeared once more, his expression professionally composed. He announced that the storm would pass by morning, and dinner would be served earlier, just in case the weather worsened. The widow thanked him with an elegant nod, though her gaze lingered on the Colonel before she rose to leave. Miss Marple watched them both depart, her knitting untouched, her eyes reflecting the restless sea beyond the window. Secrets, she thought, were not unlike storms. They could darken quickly, and when they finally broke, there was always a little damage left behind. Chapter 2. The Guest Who Never Came Down. Morning arrived wrapped in a veil of mist. The sea, once glittering, had turned a soft grey, and the air carried that clean, briny scent of a storm spent. In the dining room of the Majestic Palm, guests gathered over coffee and rolls, their conversations gentle and unhurried. Miss Marple, punctual as always, took her place by the window. She was just buttering a slice of toast when she noticed something peculiar in the corridor beyond the archway. A breakfast tray sat outside one of the rooms upstairs, untouched, silver covers in place, orange juice still full to the brim, the toast cooling on its plate. The maid, young and round-faced, moved nervously past it, carrying linens, glancing at the tray as though it was something that might scold her. Miss Marple finished her tea and, under the polite excuse of stretching her legs, went to investigate. Outside room 203, the name Mr. Talbot was neatly written on the brass tag fixed to the door. "Excuse me, my dear," Miss Marple said kindly, addressing the maid who had reappeared. "That tray's been there some time, hasn't it?" The girl hesitated. "Yes, ma'am, since 8:30. I thought perhaps he was asleep, but it's nearly 10 now. Mr. Harcourt said not to disturb him." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze shifting to the carpet. The faintest indentation of footsteps led from the tray toward the stairs, but none returned. The corridor, though empty, felt oddly watchful, as if the silence were holding its breath. when she returned to the dining room. She mentioned it lightly to Mr. Harcourt, who was circulating among the tables with his usual courteous smile. "I noticed a tray still waiting outside a guest's door," she said pleasantly. "Room 203, I believe." The manager's smile faltered almost imperceptibly.
"Ah, yes, Mr. Talbot. I imagine he's gone out early for a walk."
"Many of our guests enjoy the cliffs after a storm. How very energetic," Miss Marple murmured, her blue eyes steady on his face. "Though I did happen to notice his shoes by the door." Mr. Harcourt blinked, then laughed lightly. "I dare say he has another pair." Yet his hand went to his collar, straightening it needlessly. "Nothing to worry about, Miss Marple. I'm sure he'll be down directly." But as the minutes passed and the tables emptied, no one had seen Mr. Talbot. His chair remained vacant, his name still printed neatly on the guest list by the door. Even Lady Caroline, cheerful as ever, began to remark on it. "Perhaps he's one of those shy, bookish types," she suggested. "The kind who breakfast in solitude and write letters about the weather." Miss Marple smiled, but something in her mind was already arranging itself like a jigsaw. An untouched breakfast, a nervous maid, a manager too quick to explain. She took a stroll in the hall after breakfast, pausing again by room 203. The door was closed, the brass keyhole glinting faintly in the morning light. She noticed a faint draught near the bottom, a small movement of air that spoke of an open window somewhere inside. The maid appeared again, carrying fresh towels.
"I'll tidy later, ma'am," she whispered.
"Mr. Harcourt says we're not to disturb the room till after luncheon." Miss Marple nodded kindly, her expression calm though her curiosity stirred. People often assumed mysteries were born in moments of loud drama, a scream, a shattered vase, a cry for help. Yet experience had taught her otherwise. It was the quiet things, the ordinary moments left slightly askew, that carried the weight of real unease. Somewhere, she thought, a small wrongness had already taken root, and as she walked away, the faintest echoes seemed to linger behind her, the sound of absence, clear as a bell, for indeed a missing man leaves louder echoes than a shouting crowd. By late morning, the mist had thinned into a pale shimmer above the sea, and the Majestic Palm had resumed its usual rhythm, the faint ring of the front bell, the soft glide of servants' shoes, the gentle gossip of guests in the lounge. Yet something beneath that calm pattern had begun to shift. Miss Marple, moving through the foyer on her way to fetch a book, paused by the reception desk. The key rack hung neatly as always, gleaming brass hooks each bearing a numbered tag, except for one small gap where room 203 should have been. "Mr. Talbot hasn't left his key?" she asked in her mild way. The young clerk, startled, flushed pink.
Oh, no, miss. He keeps it, I suppose."
"Some guests prefer that." Miss Marple nodded pleasantly. "Quite right. Though I always find it comforting to know exactly who's in and who's out, don't you?" The clerk mumbled something about busy mornings, and she let him off with a kind smile. But in her mind, the picture grew clearer. A locked door, an untouched tray, and now a missing key. By noon, curiosity had spread like perfume. Even the more reserved guests whispered in the corridors. The maid, her hands twisting her apron, came to Miss Marple near the stairwell. "I meant to clean Mr. Talbot's room, ma'am," she said softly, "but the door's still locked."
"I've knocked twice." No answer. Miss Marple accompanied her up the stairs, her tread light but purposeful.
The hallway was bright with midday sun, but the air felt oddly cool. The maid rapped again, 3 quick knocks. Silence. She bent and tried the handle. It turned slightly, then stopped. Locked. Firm from within. Mr. Harcourt arrived moments later, flustered but trying for calm authority. "Most likely he's gone for a walk and locked it behind him," he said. "Some guests, especially gentlemen travelling alone, are particular about their things." "Perhaps," Miss Marple agreed gently, "though it would be unusual to lock oneself in and take the key out as well." The remark seemed to unsettle him. He fetched a passkey from his pocket, polished brass glinting, and tried it in the lock. It refused to turn. His smile thinned. "Strange," he murmured.
It should open any room in the house. Miss Marple said nothing.
She simply looked at the maid, whose eyes were now wide with worry.
Could it be jammed?
The girl asked.
Or perhaps... A muffled sound from within cut her off. Not a voice, but something faint, a scrape, or perhaps the sigh of a curtain against the window pane.
The maid gasped. Mr. Harcourt's hand trembled on the handle. "Stand back," he said finally, his voice low. "I'll have to force it." A moment later, with the help of a porter, the door burst inward. Dust motes danced in the sudden light. The room stood immaculate, bed made, suitcase neatly closed, coat hung on its peg. Only the breakfast tray, cold and congealed, betrayed time's passing. The single window on the far wall stood open by an inch, letting in a sharp gust of sea air that rustled the curtains like restless ghosts. Mr. Harcourt stepped inside, calling softly, "Mr. Talbot?" No answer came. He crossed to the window, peering down. The cliffs dropped steeply toward the beach below, where waves lapped in slow rhythm. Nothing moved there but gulls. Miss Marple, following more slowly, surveyed the scene with calm eyes, the empty bed, the slippers neatly aligned, the hat still on the chair. "So," she murmured, "the gentleman has gone out after all. Only he appears to have done so without using the door." The maid crossed herself, whispering something about bad luck. The manager frowned, trying to compose himself. We'll inform the police, of course. Merely a precaution." Miss Marple gave a quiet nod. "A very wise precaution," she said. Her gaze lingered on the open window and the curtains, shifting like whispers. For when a door stays locked and a man vanishes, there's usually a story waiting to be told, and not always a pleasant one. Chapter 3. Whispers in the Hall. The afternoon sun slanted through the hotel's tall windows, turning the lobby's brass fixtures to dull gold. Yet despite the light, an unease lingered, an almost tangible hush that made every whisper sound too loud. Miss Marple sat discreetly in a corner chair with her knitting bag, looking for all the world like a harmless old lady resting her feet. In truth, she missed nothing. The staff moved with forced cheer, the guests spoke in lowered tones, and Mr. Harcourt, the manager, looked as though he hadn't slept in days. He approached her at last, twisting his watch chain nervously. "Miss Marple," he said in a strained voice, "might I have a word?" "In private, if you please." She rose at once, allowing him to guide her into his small office behind the reception desk. The room smelled faintly of tobacco and polish, though both scents did little to disguise the air of anxiety. "I wanted to thank you," he began, forcing a smile, "for your discretion this morning. About the matter in room 203. He hesitated, then leaned closer. "The truth is, Miss Marple, the Majestic Palm cannot afford, well, any hint of scandal."
"Not with the gala tomorrow."
"The press, the sponsors, the guests, it would ruin us." Miss Marple listened quietly, hands folded in her lap. "Quite understandable," she said kindly. "Though one does wonder whether quieting a matter is the same as solving it." He flushed. "I only meant if we could just keep things contained until after the gala. The police are, of course, investigating, but until they have something definite—" He trailed off. "You see, I'm responsible for everyone under this roof." "Indeed," she murmured. "And a heavy responsibility it is." Her eyes drifted toward the window, where a faint breeze stirred the curtain edge. Outside she could hear the waves striking the shore in slow rhythm, steady, inevitable. "Tell me, Mr. Harcourt," she said lightly, "do you think Mr. Talbot left voluntarily? His fingers stilled on the chain."
"I can't say, madam."
"But if he didn't, then someone else must know why, and that's what frightens me most." When she left him a few minutes later, Miss Marple took a slow turn through the upper corridor. The staff were scrubbing the floors and polishing the banisters with unusual fervour, as if cleanliness might erase suspicion. Yet near room 203 she paused. The door was now unlatched, and a constable stood inside taking notes. She didn't intrude, she had no wish to meddle openly, but her eyes caught something small by the skirting board, just beneath the window. A faint mark on the carpet.
"Damp, shaped like the partial imprint of a heel. Curious?" she whispered, kneeling briefly as though straightening her stocking.
The footprint pointed not toward the door, but from the window, An odd direction for someone climbing out. She straightened, smiling vaguely when the constable looked her way. "Just admiring the light," she said cheerfully, before walking on. In truth, her mind was already turning the puzzle over. A locked room, a missing man, and a damp footprint facing inward. Downstairs again, she found the lobby quieter. Guests gathered in the drawing room, whispering theories between sips of tea. The pianist in the corner struck a few nervous chords before giving up entirely. Even the sound of the sea outside seemed to fall into uneasy rhythm with the mood of the house. As she passed the front desk, Mr. Harcourt looked up quickly. "Everything all right, Miss Marple?" he asked too quickly. She gave him a reassuring nod. "Oh, yes, dear."
"Everything's quite all right for the moment," but as she stepped out into the terrace,
the wind carried faint voices from an open window above. Two chambermaids whispering hurriedly, one saying, "She saw him last night." "I tell you, near the service stairs." Miss Marple paused, her expression unreadable. "Secrets always leave traces," she murmured to herself, her gaze drifting toward the grey horizon, even when swept beneath carpets. The following morning broke grey and damp, the sea hidden behind a soft mist that clung to the windows. Breakfast at the Majestic Palm was a subdued affair. Clinking spoons, murmured conversation, and the faint creak of wicker chairs on the veranda. Miss Marple sat alone at a corner table, stirring her tea with deliberate slowness. She could feel the tension in the room like a draught through a crack. No one mentioned the missing guest, but everyone thought of him. When she rose to leave, a timid voice stopped her. "Excuse me, miss."
Might you have a moment?"
It was Lily, the young chambermaid who'd been polishing silver the night before. Her hands twisted the edge of her apron nervously. Miss Marple gave her a gentle smile. "Of course, my dear. Shall we find somewhere quieter?" They stepped out into the small conservatory overlooking the garden. Rain tapped lightly against the glass panes, and the scent of wet earth filled the air. Lily perched on the edge of a wicker seat, glancing around as if afraid to be overheard.
"I shouldn't be talking about this," she began, "but I can't stop thinking about it."
"You see, I was on the corridor last night. The same one as room 203, Miss Marple nodded, folding her hands in her lap. "Go on, dear."
"Take your time." "There were voices," Lily said, lowering her voice to a whisper.
Men's voices. I couldn't see who it was. The lights were dim, and I didn't want to be caught listening. But I heard one word clear as anything.
"Forgery, just that," said Sharp, like a warning. She hesitated.
Then it went quiet, and when I looked round the corner, there was no one there. Miss Marple's expression didn't change, but a spark of thought flickered behind her eyes. "Forgery, you say?" "That's a rather particular word to overhear. And you're quite sure of it?" Lily nodded.
"As sure as I'm sitting here."
"I told Mr. Harcourt this morning, but he said not to go repeating it." He looked frightened, miss.
"Proper frightened." Miss Marple reached across and patted the girl's hand.
"You did quite right to come to me. Sometimes managers have broader concerns than truth, especially when they fear for their reputations. But you mustn't worry yourself. Secrets have a way of slipping out at the right time." The maid's shoulders relaxed a little under her kind tone. "I don't want trouble, miss."
"Only if someone's done something wrong, I'd hate to think it'll stay hidden." Miss Marple smiled softly. "So would I, my dear."
So would I. When Lily had gone, Miss Marple sat a while longer, watching raindrops race each other down the glass. Forgery. It was a word that suggested not violence, but deceit. A paper lie, perhaps. A signature turned false. A painting too perfect to be true. She thought of the guests, the novelist, with his air of studied mystery, the widow whose laughter never reached her eyes, and Colonel Redmayne, who spoke too quickly when questioned about his past travels. Yes, plenty of people here could have reason to whisper such a word. Later that day, Miss Marple took a quiet walk along the upper hall. She paused near a framed landscape painting outside room 203. Up close, the signature in the corner seemed faintly smudged, as though wiped and redrawn. "Curious," she murmured. She ran a gloved finger along the frame's edge and found a faint trace of dust disturbed recently. That evening, she returned to the sitting room where the guests gathered by the fire to escape the persistent rain. Conversation drifted to trivialities, the storm, the quality of the tea. the expected gala, but Miss Marple's thoughts stayed on that single, whispered word. One word, she knew, could unravel an entire story. She smiled faintly, reaching for her knitting once more. One whispered word, she thought, can change the shape of a mystery. Chapter 4. The Charity Gala. The Majestic Palm glowed like a jewel that evening, its great ballroom alive with golden light and the shimmer of polished glass. Laughter mingled with the soft strains of a string quartet, and the air carried the perfume of lilies and champagne. From the terrace, the sea reflected the dancing lights in ripples of silver. Guests in evening dress moved gracefully across the parquet floor, their conversations drifting in pleasant waves. Yet amid the gaiety, Miss Marple felt a quiet unease, subtle but unmistakable. She had always believed that parties, much like people, revealed more through what they tried to conceal. As she sat near a marble column, her knitting neatly tucked into a small bag, she watched faces rather than gowns. It was not long before one face drew her attention. The widow, Mrs.
Langford, radiant in emerald silk and diamonds that caught the light with every turn of her head. She was smiling, yes, but her eyes flicked repeatedly toward the entrance doors, the kind of glances one gives when waiting for something or someone important.
A waiter passed with a silver tray of champagne flutes. Miss Marple accepted one, though she only sipped. Her gaze remained fixed on Mrs. Langford. The widow was speaking animatedly to Colonel Redmayne, but her responses came too quickly, her laughter brittle at the edges. When the Colonel turned away for a moment, she checked the entrance again. Still no one. The musicians began a waltz and couples filled the floor, swirling to the rhythm of bows and piano keys. Miss Marple could almost forget the missing guest. From room 203, the whispered word, forgery, the manager's nervous glances, but only almost. For every so often the wind rattled the windows, reminding her of the locked door and the open window that no one had yet explained. As the waltz ended, Mrs. Langford drifted toward the refreshment table. Miss Marple, never one to ignore an opportunity, for gentle inquiry, followed at an unhurried pace. She reached the table just as the widow murmured something to one of the musicians, a young violinist refilling his glass of punch. He promised he'd come, Mrs. Langford said softly, her voice barely audible over the rustle of gowns. The musician nodded uncertainly as though unsure whether to respond. Miss Marple's ears caught the words easily, and she turned as though admiring the flowers nearby. When Mrs. Langford noticed her, she managed a polite smile. "A delightful evening, isn't it?" she said, her tone too bright. "Quite delightful," Miss Marple replied, "though I imagine it feels incomplete when one expects a certain guest who hasn't yet appeared." For a heartbeat, the widow's mask slipped. "Oh, it's nothing," she said quickly. "Only an old friend who must have been delayed. You know how travel can be this time of year?" "Yes," said Miss Marple mildly. "Unpredictable, isn't it? Especially for those who prefer to remain unseen." Mrs. Langford hesitated, then excused herself, disappearing into the crowd with a nervous flutter of her shawl. Miss Marple watched her go, her mind quietly assembling the puzzle pieces that had begun to surface. An absent man, a missing key, and now a woman waiting for someone who might never come. From the balcony above, Mr. Harcourt surveyed the room, his smile fixed, but his eyes darting anxiously. He caught Miss Marple's gaze for an instant, and looked away, pretending to be engrossed in a conversation with a guest. The poor man was stretched thin between hospitality and fear. As the music swelled again, Miss Marple set down her glass. Sometimes, she thought, absences speak louder than arrivals. And tonight, the silence surrounding one missing man was beginning to drown out the music. The evening drifted toward its height, the orchestra now playing a lively foxtrot as waiters wove between the guests with practiced grace. The air inside the Majestic Palm shimmered with perfume and laughter, yet beneath the sparkle a faint tension pulsed, like a string drawn too tight. Miss Marple, ever patient in her observations, had learned to notice when joy began to fray at the edges. After the second dance set, she excused herself from a well-meaning couple, eager to discuss village fates, and found her way toward the cloakroom. She had no need of her wrap yet, but her instincts urged her to step away from the noise. The narrow corridor leading to the cloakroom was dimmer, lined with gilt mirrors and portraits that seemed to watch as she passed. The muffled sound of the orchestra reached her ears, distant now, like music from another world. Inside, a young attendant was folding shawls and tidying gloves. She greeted Miss Marple with a polite smile before turning back to her work. Miss Marple offered a kind word about the chilly sea breeze and lingered near the counter. That was when she noticed it, a small scrap of paper lying half beneath a sequined evening bag. It looked like a torn corner of a note, hastily folded and then forgotten. Curiosity being as natural to her as breathing, Miss Marple bent to pick it up. The handwriting was hurried, almost impatient. Midnight. The terrace. No name, no signature, just the promise, or perhaps the threat, of a meeting. Miss Marple's pulse did not quicken, but her thoughts did. She slipped the paper discreetly into her reticule, thanked the attendant for her help, and stepped back into the corridor. The lights flickered slightly as a gust of wind pressed against the windows. Somewhere beyond the ballroom doors, laughter rose again, covering the faint creak of the old hotel's timbers. She paused near a mirror to adjust her shawl and watched the reflection of the hall behind her. Mrs. Langford, the widow, was crossing toward the entrance, her face pale beneath the soft glow of the chandeliers. She held her wrap tightly and whispered something to Mr. Harcourt, who nodded with visible relief. Whatever words passed between them seemed urgent, but carefully hidden beneath polite smiles. Then, with a glance around, Mrs. Langford slipped out toward the upper staircase. Miss Marple waited a moment longer before returning to the ballroom. She moved slowly, letting her eyes wander over the room, the colonel laughing too loudly, the novelist scribbling in a notebook between dances, the musicians exchanging curious glances. Everyone appeared perfectly at ease, yet the atmosphere carried an undercurrent of expectation. Midnight, she thought, would not arrive quietly. She found her seat once more near the window and resumed her knitting, the needles clicking softly in rhythm with the music. On the surface, she seemed the very picture of elderly calm, a harmless observer enjoying the evening's charm. But behind her gentle expression, her mind traced connections. The missing man, the word forgery, the widow's anxious waiting, and now this mysterious note. If the meeting was meant for her absent guest, it could mean danger, or perhaps revelation. As the evening waned and guests began drifting upstairs, Miss Marple lingered by the dying fire. Outside, waves rolled restlessly against the shore, and a thin moon hung low over the water. Somewhere beyond the terrace doors, the wind whispered across the marble steps. She thought again of the note's words, simple, direct, and brimming with implication. Midnight, she murmured softly to herself. Midnight meetings rarely lead to honest dealings. Rising from her chair, she gathered her shawl and headed quietly for her room, every sense alert. The ballroom lights dimmed behind her, but Miss Marple knew the night was far from over. Something waited beyond those terrace doors, and before dawn it would make itself known. Chapter 5. The Terrace at Midnight. The night air carried a chill that nipped softly at Miss Marple's cheeks as she stepped out onto the terrace. The ballroom lights glowed faintly through the tall windows behind her, but out here only the moon reigned. Its silver light lay across the flagstones like spilled milk, and beyond the balustrade the sea murmured endlessly against the rocks. She drew her shawl closer around her shoulders and listened. The hotel had gone quiet, doors closed, voices faded, the hour growing near to midnight. She took a seat on a wrought-iron bench beside a cluster of potted palms. The damp scent of salt and jasmine filled the air. Her knitting lay folded in her lap, though her fingers itched with the same restless curiosity that had kept her awake. Somewhere nearby, a clock struck 12, each note echoing softly against the cliffs. And then, faintly, she heard it, the crunch of footsteps on the gravel path below. Miss Marple leaned slightly forward, eyes fixed on the far end of the terrace. Two figures emerged from the shadows, their outlines blurred in the moonlight. One moved quickly, nervously, the widow, Mrs. Langford. The other followed more cautiously, a man whose face the darkness kept hidden. Their meeting was not affectionate. It had the tautness of fear. "You shouldn't have come," Mrs. Langford whispered, her voice trembling. "It's far too risky." "Someone might see us." "I had no choice," the man replied, his tone low but urgent. "They'll find out everything if I don't put it right." "You don't understand what's at stake." "Oh, I understand perfectly," she said, her voice sharper now. "You're frightened because your clever little plan has fallen apart." Miss Marple caught every word, though the wind threatened to carry them away. She remained still, hidden behind the shadow of the palms, her breath steady. The widow stepped closer to the man, clutching his sleeve. The moonlight slid across her face, anxious, pale, beautiful still, but marked by desperation. "Listen to me," he said again. "If Harcourt knows what you've done—" "Harcourt," she interrupted. "Don't be absurd. He hasn't the courage to confront me. He's too busy pretending nothing's wrong." The man hesitated, looking toward the hotel as though expecting someone to appear. His features were still veiled in darkness, but Miss Marple noted his stance. Tall, shoulders slightly hunched, a man accustomed to keeping secrets. "This isn't about courage," he said at last.
"It's about consequences. They're closer than you think." Mrs. Langford drew back, her expression tightening.
"And what about you? Don't pretend you're innocent in all this. You forged the papers, not I." The man's head turned sharply.
"Keep your voice down." "I will not," she snapped.
"You promised me it was foolproof, that no one would ever know. And now that poor man, Mr. Talbot, was it? Has vanished, and you think I'll take the blame." The name hung in the air like a tolling bell. Miss Marple's pulse quickened, though her composure never faltered. So, the missing guest and the forged documents were indeed entwined. The threads were beginning to tighten. The man stepped closer to the widow, his voice now a warning. "Be careful, Margaret. There are eyes everywhere. If anyone learns what's hidden, it won't just be your reputation ruined. It will be your freedom." For a long moment, neither spoke.
Only the sea answered, restless and cold.
Then the man turned, his shadow gliding across the terrace stones, and disappeared into the path leading toward the gardens. Mrs. Langford stood motionless, staring after him. A single tear glinted on her cheek before she pressed a hand to her mouth and hurried back inside. Miss Marple sat quietly, her mind a tapestry of new connections. Even under moonlight, she thought, watching the empty terrace, lies can glimmer like truth, and tonight they shone very brightly indeed. Miss Marple remained seated on the terrace bench, the chill of the night sinking into her bones. The widow had disappeared back into the hotel, leaving the moonlight to silver the stones and the restless sea to murmur below. The night stretched on, quiet, but for the gentle sighing of the wind. She thought she was alone, until the faintest sound broke the stillness. Footsteps, soft but purposeful, came along the gravel path leading toward the cliffs. She rose slowly, holding her shawl tightly, ears straining in the darkness. The steps paused near the edge of the terrace. Then, there it was, a faint cry, almost swallowed by the crashing waves, a single, sharp note that seemed to pierce the calm. Miss Marple froze, her heart steady but alert. Someone was in trouble, and the sound of fear, even so quiet, carried far across the moonlit gardens. She hurried down the steps, careful not to make noise, peering through the shadows along the cliff path. The night offered no clear view, only the glint of the wet stones, the swaying of the long grasses, and the restless shimmer of the ocean below. Her mind raced through possibilities, a stumble, a deliberate push, or something entirely unplanned. Whoever it was, they had disappeared as quickly as the cry had come. By morning, the hotel and village were abuzz. The sea had swallowed the night's mist, revealing a pale, chilly dawn. Staff and early rising guests clustered near the cliff path, pointing at a small, solitary object on the rocks below, a man's hat. Worn, slightly crumpled, it lay near the edge where the waves lapped and retreating foam marked the dark stones. There was no sign of the man himself. Mr. Harcourt appeared at the scene, his expression carefully controlled, but betraying a flicker of alarm. "It seems," he said, his voice unsteady, "that one of our guests may have suffered."
"An accident." The words hung in the morning air, uncertain and heavy.
Guests whispered behind gloved hands and umbrellas, imagining all manner of misfortune, yet none dared venture too close to the slippery cliffs. Miss Marple observed quietly from a distance. Her sharp eyes noted the way the widow lingered near the terrace railing, pale and tense, and how the colonel's stoic face betrayed a flicker of unease. The novelist scribbled furiously into a notebook, though his expression suggested more curiosity than grief. Even in the calm light of day, the shadows of the night's events clung stubbornly to the scene. Conversation spread like ripples through the hotel.
"An accident, I suppose," one guest murmured.
"Cliff paths are treacherous, especially after the storm." Another shook their head. Or perhaps something else entirely. The man was not well known here.
"Who knows what might have happened?"
Miss Marple smiled faintly to herself. In her experience, the truth often wore many masks, and one cry in the night could echo far wider than anyone imagined. By mid-morning, the local constable had arrived, questioning the staff and inspecting the cliff edge. The hat had become a clue, a solitary marker of absence and uncertainty. Miss Marple stood at a discreet distance, noting the slight scuffs on the stones, the footprints partially washed by the tide, and the disturbed foliage along the path. There was more to the night than mere accident, she suspected, though the pieces had yet to fall fully into place. As the sun climbed, bathing the hotel in gentle light, rumours swirled through the Majestic Palm and the village beyond. Some whispered of tragedy, others of foul play, and a few murmured that the shadows of the night had kept their own secrets. Miss Marple, knitting quietly in her room, considered the scene she had witnessed and the echoes of that faint cry. Indeed, a single cry in the night, she thought, can echo through an entire village, and its reverberations were just beginning to be felt. Chapter 6. The Web of Lies. Miss Marple spent the morning quietly in the hotel's small reading room, where the scent of old leather and polished wood seemed to encourage careful thought. The storm from days past had left the garden glistening, and pale sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting lattice shadows on the carpet. Guests were scattered among the chairs and tables, some reading, some exchanging subdued conversation. She moved deliberately between the shelves, ostensibly browsing for a book, though her keen eyes were scanning the corners of the room and the small curiosities on display. Near a low cabinet, she noticed a slightly crooked frame leaning against a stack of travel pamphlets. Lifting it gently, she saw a photograph, slightly faded with age, the corners worn, yet unmistakable in its clarity. There, smiling in the haze of years, were Mr. Talbot and Mrs. Langford, standing side by side at some country house fete. Both were younger, their postures relaxed, but the photograph hinted at an intimacy that the present widow's restrained manners belied. Miss Marple's fingers lingered on the frame. The past, she thought, had a way of persisting quietly in photographs, waiting for someone observant enough to notice. She tucked the photograph into her reticule, careful to avoid drawing attention, and made her way to the corridor, where Lily, the chambermaid, was arranging fresh towels outside the guest rooms.
"Miss Marple," the girl began hesitantly, "I don't know if I should mention this again, but—"
"You might want to know something about Mr. Talbot and Mrs. Langford." The older woman inclined her head gently.
"I always appreciate honesty, my dear." Lily took a deep breath, glancing down the hallway, as though to ensure no one else was within earshot. "They argued, ma'am," she whispered.
"About money, and about some papers. I heard it in passing, and I thought it didn't concern me, but it seemed serious. Mr. Talbot was very upset. Mrs. Langford, she tried to calm him, but they
"They quarrelled," Her voice trembled slightly, and Miss Marple patted her hand reassuringly.
Quite right to tell me, dear. Sometimes a small fragment of the past can illuminate the present. Miss Marple's mind traced patterns, linking the photograph and Lily's words. The man who had vanished, the note about midnight, and now the hints of old quarrels, all pieces of a tangled web that connected the current mystery to bygone events. She thought of the forged papers mentioned the night before, the whispers, the locked room, and the terrace meeting under the moon. It was all part of a sequence carefully obscured by civility and charm. Later, as she quietly observed the guests in the lounge, she saw the widow seated near the fireplace, her posture elegant, but her fingers tapping nervously against her evening gloves. The photograph had been taken years ago, yet its influence lingered, like a shadow that refuses to fade. Miss Marple reflected on the notion that in small villages or even grand hotels, the past never stays buried. It waits, persistent, until someone notices the faint footprints it leaves behind. The maid lingered nearby, and Miss Marple allowed her to pass without comment, though her mind was actively connecting threads: the quarrel over money, the papers, Mr. Talbot's disappearance, and Mrs. Langford's unease at the gala. Each detail, seemingly innocuous, formed part of the intricate tapestry of deception and secrecy that had quietly settled over the Majestic Palm. She smiled faintly, her expression calm, but her thoughts were far from idle. In quiet observation, she was slowly unraveling the story hidden in the shadows, where the past and present intersected with unsettling precision. By late afternoon, Miss Marple returned the photograph to the cabinet, though she left it angled slightly differently, a subtle invitation for those with curiosity to notice. Secrets, she reflected, often reveal themselves to careful eyes, and in this case, the past had begun to whisper its warnings with quiet insistence. As she sipped her tea, the events of the night and the day coalesced into a single notion, that even the grandest facades could not fully conceal the truths embedded in memory and photograph alike. The past, she knew, had a long reach indeed. That evening, the lounge at the Majestic Palm carried a quieter, more intimate air. The storm had fully passed, leaving a crisp, cool breeze that rustled the curtain. Guests gathered in small clusters, sipping sherry or tea, the conversation light and cautious. Miss Marple sat near the fireplace, her knitting resting in her lap, when Colonel Redmayne approached. His usual brisk demeanour was tempered tonight by an unusual gravity. "Miss Marple," he began, settling into the chair across from her, "there is something I ought to tell you, though it is no matter for gossip or casual ears." His tone carried the weight of a confession, and Miss Marple inclined her head with gentle patience. "I think you should know about Mr. Talbot." The Colonel cleared his throat, his eyes fixed on the flames. "We served together long ago."
Talbot was a man of
peculiar methods. Clever, yes, but unscrupulous. He had a habit of altering documents, military reports, discharge papers, even pensions. Not with violence, mind you, but with an ease that left no one the wiser until long after. He paused, taking a measured sip of sherry, then continued. "It seems to me that he came here not as a guest, but as a creditor of secrets. Mrs. Langford, your widow in emerald silk, is fortunate beyond ordinary means. She inherited her late husband's fortune under circumstances that, well, they were unusual." Miss Marple's eyes remained calm, though her mind worked rapidly to connect the threads. "You think, Colonel, that Mr. Talbot intended to leverage this?"
she asked softly. "I do," he admitted.
He knew of the inheritance, the questions that might arise if anyone looked too closely at her late husband's accounts. Talbot, he was not a cruel man, but he was clever, and he saw opportunity. Blackmail, perhaps, or at least a confrontation. That explains his sudden interest, his secrecy, and now his disappearance. His gaze dropped to the rug. "It is a delicate matter. Too delicate to be spoken aloud to every guest." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her fingers brushing her knitting needles absent-mindedly. "So the past has reached forward," she murmured, "and shadows it once cast are influencing events here tonight." "Precisely," the Colonel said, his voice low. Truth often hides behind a uniform's shine, or, in Talbot's case, behind careful planning and reputation. We are too ready to trust appearances. A man in proper attire, polite, well-groomed, seems harmless. Yet the intentions behind it are another matter entirely. Miss Marple leaned back, her eyes still on the fire. And the widow? You believe she was unaware or complicit? The Colonel shrugged slightly, a gesture heavy with caution.
I cannot say.
She is shrewd, certainly. Perhaps she sought to protect herself from Talbot's schemes. Perhaps she feared exposure. Either way, the consequences are entwined with what he knew and what he intended to do with that knowledge. Outside, the last light of day faded behind the cliffs. A few gulls called across the air, but the hotel was otherwise still. Miss Marple appreciated the delicate balance between revelation and restraint. The Colonel's words, though careful, provided clarity that was otherwise absent in the hushed corridors and whispered meetings. The pieces of the puzzle, once scattered, were beginning to form recognizable shapes. I am grateful, Colonel, she said softly. Sometimes understanding the past, those careful, hidden choices, explains more than any evidence in front of us.
It is the human element, after all, that guides the actions of even the most meticulous. He inclined his head, relief faintly visible.
Just be discreet, Miss Marple. This is not a tale for public discussion, and the lady herself must remain unaware. Talbot's disappearance has stirred enough speculation already. Miss Marple gave a faint smile, one that suggested both reassurance and quiet curiosity. Discretion is a friend I know well. And yet, she murmured to herself, as the Colonel rose and retreated, the past never truly sleeps, and truths long hidden have a way of surfacing, often in the most unexpected places. Chapter 7. Miss Marple Sets a Trap. The drawing-room at the Majestic Palm had never looked more inviting. Afternoon light filtered softly through lace curtains, falling upon polished mahogany tables and the delicate gleam of silver tea services. The scent of freshly brewed Earl Grey mingled with the subtle perfume of lilacs from the terrace, creating a calm atmosphere, yet Miss Marple knew that beneath the genteel tranquillity, currents of unease swirled like invisible eddies. She had invited the key guests for tea, a small, deliberate gathering that included Mrs. Langford, Colonel Redmayne, the novelist Mr. Faraday, and even Mr. Harcourt, who looked simultaneously relieved and apprehensive to be included. The table was set with delicate china, sugar tongs gleaming, and plates of scones and biscuits arranged with careful symmetry. Miss Marple herself moved among them with gentle efficiency, pouring tea with a smile that suggested warmth, while her mind worked with quiet precision. "Do sit."
"All of you?" she said lightly, settling into her own chair with knitting tucked aside.
"I thought we might enjoy a quiet moment together before the evening begins."
"A chance to discuss?"
"Well, anything at all." Her tone was casual, but the invitation carried an undercurrent of purpose. She knew that in the guise of civility, the sharpest revelations often emerged. Conversation began with pleasantries, remarks about the weather, the beauty of the terrace, and Mr. Faraday's upcoming literary project. Laughter was polite, voices soft, but Miss Marple listened carefully. A slight hesitation here, a glance exchanged there. Small contradictions began to show themselves. Colonel Redmayne spoke of his early morning walk along the cliff, claiming solitude, yet Mrs. Langford's eyes flickered knowingly as if she had seen him passing. By Mr. Harcourt praised the hotel, staff's efficiency, but faltered slightly when Miss Marple asked about the handling of room 203. Brushing over details too quickly, Miss Marple sipped her tea slowly, letting the warmth settle before speaking again. "It is curious," she said lightly, "how sometimes one might say they were elsewhere, yet someone else has noticed their passing. Timing, after all, can be a rather revealing thing." She allowed a faint pause, eyes lifting to meet each of the guests in turn. Small ripples of discomfort passed through the group. Mrs. Langford pressed her lips together, tilting her head with polite interest. "Do you think time can be so easily misjudged?" she asked, masking the tension in a carefully measured tone. Miss Marple only smiled gently, never accusing, merely suggesting the possibility. The novelist chimed in with an anecdote about misremembered train schedules, but in doing so, he contradicted a statement he had made to the maid earlier about his route. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly as she noted it, taking mental notes without a hint of judgment. Each contradiction, each careful misstatement, became a brushstroke on the canvas of the evening, revealing outlines of truth beneath the polite veneer. Colonel Redmayne cleared his throat, adjusting his cuffs. "It seems," he said cautiously, "that perhaps we have all been a little
hasty in our assumption." His gaze darted toward Miss, though he did not speak further.
Miss Marple inclined her head slightly, acknowledging his candour, while quietly observing the subtle tension coiling beneath smiles. By the time the second pot of tea had been poured, the room was alive not with noise but with quiet scrutiny. Miss Marple allowed each guest to reveal themselves in measured doses, questions posed lightly, yet pointedly, contradictions emerging naturally. Each small revelation, she knew, would later prove significant in untangling the events surrounding Mr. Talbot's disappearance and the whispers of forgery. As the afternoon waned, Miss Marple settled back in her chair, teacup in hand, her expression calm yet alert. Every cup of tea, she thought, watching her guests closely, should stir something, even the truth. And in this cosy setting, under polite smiles and soft conversation, the threads of deception were beginning to unravel, just as she had quietly intended. The afternoon sunlight had softened to a gentle gold when Miss Marple reached into her reticule and drew out a small, folded letter, the very scrap she had found earlier in the cloakroom. She held it delicately between her fingers, smoothing the creases as though treating a fragile treasure. The guests, sensing a shift in tone, fell silent. Even the ticking of the grandfather clock seemed to slow in anticipation. "This," Miss Marple began softly, "was discovered in the cloakroom, overlooked until now. I think it may shed light on the events that have puzzled us all these past days." She unfolded the paper carefully, revealing neat, yet slightly hurried handwriting. "It appears," she continued, "that the missing Mr. Talbot and Mrs. Langford were once partners in rather questionable dealings. The letter suggests a plan, some form of forgery which it seems they undertook together." Mrs. Langford's hand twitched in her lap. She gave a faint smile that failed to reach her eyes, but no one dared speak. Miss Marple allowed the silence to settle, letting the weight of the revelation hang gently in the air. "Yet," she said, her voice as calm as ever, "Mr. Talbot's last note implies disagreement. He demanded more than had been promised, and feared Mrs. Langford's reaction if she did not comply. That perhaps explains the tension I observed last night."
And the urgency of their meeting under the moonlight. Colonel Redmayne cleared his throat softly.
But Miss Marple only raised a hand in a quiet gesture of patience. She turned her eyes toward Mrs. Langford, noting the subtle tremor of her fingers around the teacup. "In these small moments," she continued, "the truth has a way of revealing itself."
Even under the most practiced smiles, the hands betray the heart. The widow's gaze dropped to the table, lips pressed tightly together.
She did not speak, but her posture, rigid and self-conscious, told its own story. Miss Marple folded the letter and placed it back on the table, close enough for everyone to see, yet leaving its secrets intact for their consideration. "It seems," she said gently, "that Mr. Talbot trusted his own devices more than he trusted his companion, and that trust, or lack of it, may have led to the unfortunate events we are trying to understand." Mr. Faraday, the novelist, leaned forward slightly. "So the widow knew all along?" His voice was quiet, tinged with awe. Miss Marple inclined her head, her expression neutral but firm. "It is clear that Mrs. Langford was aware of the plan, yes. The specifics of Mr. Talbot's final demands and the consequences of his insistence are matters she now must reckon with. In the end, guilt speaks in trembling hands, as subtle as a whisper, yet unmistakable to a careful observer." Mrs. Langford's shoulders slumped slightly. She met Miss Marple's gaze with a mixture of defiance and resignation. "Yes," she admitted finally, her voice soft and barely audible. I should have stopped him, or at least warned someone. But it seemed easier to go along, and then it became more than I could manage. Miss Marple nodded gently. It is often so, my dear. Small choices accumulate quietly, until they grow into circumstances we cannot undo. But acknowledging them truthfully is the first step toward resolving what has been hidden. The group fell silent once more, reflecting on the delicate balance between intent and action. Outside, the sun cast long shadows across the terrace, mingling light and dark in a quiet mirror of the revelations within. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her gaze steady, yet warm. Knowing that the threads of deception had been revealed, the mystery's heart exposed without a single raised voice or dramatic accusation. As the guests considered the letter and its implications, the room carried a sense of gentle closure. The widow's secret had been unveiled, not with spectacle, but with calm observation. And Miss Marple, ever patient, smiled quietly to herself, content that at last the truth had begun to rest lightly in the company of those who had sought it. Chapter 8. Justice in the Drawing Room. The morning sunlight fell gently across the majestic palm, casting a warm glow over the polished floors and softly rustling curtains. Outside, the garden glimmered with dew, and the sea beyond shimmered under a clear sky, as if nature itself had washed away the remnants of the previous night's tension. Miss Marple walked quietly through the corridors, noting the subdued energy among the staff and guests. There was a gentle sense of relief in the air, though it was tinged with somber recognition of the events that had unfolded. News arrived shortly thereafter that the local authorities had recovered Mr. Talbot's body from the rocks below the cliffs. The investigation was swift but thorough. The initial assumption of a tragic accident was disproved. The marks on the stones, the angle of descent, and witnesses' accounts all pointed to deliberate action. Mr. Talbot had been pushed. The revelation sent a hush through the hotel, tempered by the calm dignity of Miss Marple, who moved among the guests with quiet reassurance. Mrs. Langford was seated in the drawing-room, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes red from tears. Her composure, once so carefully maintained, had now given way to a fragile vulnerability. The other guests gathered respectfully at a distance, giving her space, while the Colonel and Mr. Harcourt exchanged hushed words about the investigation. Miss Marple approached gently, settling into a chair beside the widow without pressing or accusation. Her presence offered calm, her expression warm yet discerning. The widow spoke softly, each word measured yet tremulous.
I never wanted this to happen," she admitted, her voice breaking.
It was fear, desperation.
"I thought if I could just manage it, nothing would go wrong. I pushed him, and now it's too late." Her gaze dropped to the floor, tears slipping quietly down her cheeks.
The weight of guilt, long suppressed beneath charm and control, was now fully visible. Miss Marple reached out, placing a reassuring hand over Mrs. Langford's. "Even good people," she said gently, "can make terrible choices in the dark. Fear and desperation can cloud judgment, and yet acknowledgement is a step toward understanding, if not absolution." She spoke with warmth, but without false comfort. The truth must be faced, but it could be met with compassion. It was a delicate balance, the lesson she had long observed in human nature. The other guests listened quietly, the room holding a reflective stillness. There were no raised voices, no dramatics, only the calm resolution that comes when facts are understood and motives gently illuminated. The hotel, once charged with hidden tension, seemed to breathe more freely. The walls, lined with portraits and gilt frames, absorbed the silence, allowing grief and understanding to coexist without chaos. Miss Marple considered the events of the past days, the locked room, the mysterious notes, the midnight meeting, and the revealed letter. Each piece had been carefully observed and placed, forming a tapestry of human frailty and moral complexity. And now, with Mr. Talbot's fate confirmed and the widow's confession given, the majestic palm could begin to reclaim its serene charm. She watched as Mrs. Langford leaned back in her chair, exhausted but calmer, and as Colonel Redmayne adjusted his coat, maintaining dignity without pretense, even Mr. Harcourt, typically anxious and tense, allowed himself a small, relieved sigh. The hotel's rhythm, once disrupted by secrets and fear, began to restore itself, each guest moving gently toward acceptance. Outside, the morning sun sparkled on the terrace, the sea calm and reassuring. Miss Marple, knitting quietly in her lap, reflected on the delicate balance between human choice and consequence. The hotel had endured, secrets had surfaced, and while justice and sorrow had left their mark, the Majestic Palm once again offered the quiet charm and warmth that had first drawn its visitors. In this restored calm, she understood that truth, compassion, and careful observation could coexist, even in the aftermath of tragedy. The storm had passed entirely, leaving behind a pale, gentle morning at the Majestic Palm. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, dancing across the polished floors and illuminating the soft fabrics of the lounge. Outside, the garden glistened with dew, the flowers refreshed, and the sea stretched endlessly, calm and inviting. The hotel had regained its serene rhythm, the faint hum of guests' voices blending with the distant cry of gulls and the occasional clink of cups on saucers. Miss Marple settled into her favourite chair by the window, a warm cup of tea cradled in her hands. The steam curled lazily upward, carrying with it the faint scent of bergamot. She took a slow sip, letting the warmth settle both body and mind. The soft murmur of conversation from the other guests rose and fell, polite chatter about the weather, the upcoming plans, and the charm of the hotel's terrace. Life, it seemed, was resuming its gentle flow, as if the previous night's tension had been a shadow that sunlight now gently dispersed. Her gaze wandered to the terrace where the events had unfolded, the sight of midnight whispers and hurried footsteps, now bathed in gold. The cliff path beyond gleamed faintly, rocks glistening where the tide had retreated. Yet even in this radiant morning, Miss Marple knew that shadows lingered, subtle and persistent. Some truths, she thought, never vanish entirely, even when the sun returns to warm the earth. The guests moved about with renewed ease. Mrs. Langford spoke softly to the Colonel, her tone subdued, tinged with reflection rather than fear. Mr. Faraday sketched quietly in his notebook, capturing the morning light, while Mr. Harcourt oversaw the staff, offering polite smiles that suggested relief and renewed composure. Each acted as if the hotel had returned to its perfect order. Yet Miss Marple observed the lingering tremors of awareness beneath the polite facades. She reflected on the sequence of events, the locked room, the absent guest, the clandestine meeting, and the revelation of motives hidden behind charm and civility. Even in a setting so refined, where laughter and elegance masked deeper currents, truth had found its way to the surface. It had arrived quietly, without spectacle, guided by observation, patience, and subtle questioning. It was a reminder that appearances, no matter how perfect, cannot indefinitely conceal reality. Sipping her tea once more, Miss Marple allowed herself a faint smile. The hotel was peaceful, the storm clouds entirely gone, and yet she understood the delicate balance of human nature. People act from fear, hope, love, and desperation, sometimes all at once, and the consequences unfold quietly, like ripples across a pond. She considered the widow, the Colonel, and the other guests, recognizing the courage it took to confront truth, whether in confession, acknowledgement, or careful restraint. Outside, the sunlight sparkled on the waves, but Miss Marple knew that some shadows, though softened, would always remain. They lingered not as threats, but as gentle reminders of the complexity of human life, the interplay of motives, and the delicate threads that connect choice and consequence. The Majestic Palm, restored to its serene charm, held the echoes of the night quietly within its walls. Raising her cup in a quiet toast to the morning, Miss Marple mused softly, almost to herself. Sunshine returns, but some shadows stay a little longer. With that, She took another sip, letting the warmth and calm of the day settle fully around her. Content in the knowledge that even perfection must eventually acknowledge the truth, and that in doing so, the world, like the hotel, could resume its gentle, enduring rhythm. And to you, dear listener,
Thank you for joining this quiet mystery.
have you ever stayed somewhere that felt just a bit too perfect? Wherever you are, I hope this tale has brought a gentle curiosity and the warmth of a story well told.